This is the all-new Ari Cascade Peak, and I'm just gonna come out and say it. This bike is good. Actually, surprisingly good, but not in the same way that many of its peers are. You see, it's not gonna be the quickest bike up that one techie climb in Arizona or the fastest down some Bellingham gnar, but it might just be one of the most well-rounded, easy to get along with bikes that I've ridden in quite a while. It is, plain and simple, a mountain bike for mountain bikers. But that's not to say there aren't some flaws, and we'll talk about those more in a little bit. But first, let's go ahead and give a little background on the Cascade Peak in general, as well as the $2,999 Pro model that we've been testing. I don't know when we're going to get to the point where we can do an Ari review without first talking about its predecessor Fazari, but we're not there just yet. In case you've been wondering what this new and seemingly familiar brand and logo is, Ari is simply a rebranding of the Utah-based company Fazari that's been building and selling bikes since 2005. In the past, under the Fazari name, the Cascade Peak shared the same frame as the Wiki and Abajo Peak, these three bikes only differing based on part spec. Confused? Well, us too, and thankfully Ari has gone ahead and streamlined things just a little bit and now only sell their entry-level full suspension bike under the Cascade Peak name, but they still have three available models. The first is the Cascade Peak Comp, which lists for $1,999. Then there's the $2,499 Elite model and the Pro model we've been testing, which lists for $2,999. Our size large test bike, set up tubeless and without pedals, weighed in at 34.4 pounds or 15.6 kilograms, which isn't bad for a wallet-friendly alloy bike. Ari claims that a good deal of this weight savings comes from the new hydroform tubing that's used throughout the frame. And while the bike may share a similar silhouette to its predecessor, the new frame ditches the kink at the front of the top tube and cleans up the shock mounts and linkages, giving the bike a more modern and aggressive look. Ari has also gone ahead and increased rear wheel travel by 5mm, making it 135mm in the back and 140mm up front. In addition, there is now room for a full 200mm dropper post in the size large frame, despite the fact that it actually has water bottle mounts on the seat tube. At the back of the bike, you'll find a rubber chainstay protector that, combined with a tidy internal cable routing, makes for a near silent ride. Lastly, the frame now features a UDH, which should make future upgrades or part replacements as pain-free as possible. Ari has also gone ahead and modernized the geometry quite a bit, but like I alluded to at the beginning of the video, not so much as to place this bike in any kind of hyper-focused niche. They've gone ahead and increased reach by about 20mm across all four sizes, putting it at 480mm on my size large. The 65-degree head tube angle is also 1.5 degrees slacker than before, and the seat tube has been steepened by 3 degrees, all the way up to 78 degrees. I'm 6'1" and have the legs of an NBA player and the torso of a horse jockey, so I appreciated that steep seat tube angle, especially in relationship to that 480mm reach and the 622mm stack height. At the back of the bike, all four sizes share the same 434mm chainstay length. I personally prefer relatively short chainstays, so I got along with these just fine. But it's worth noting, especially given the rise of size-specific rear triangles, that riders on either end of the size spectrum might not find it suiting their preferences quite as much as I did. Another welcome feature is the geometry adjusting flip chip located in the rocker link. This raises the bottom bracket and steepens the head tube just enough to actually be able to fit a 27.5-inch wheel in the back, so you could run the bike as a mullet. I never got a chance to try this out while testing, but I think it's awesome to see this on a bike that costs as little as $2,000. With the exception of that steep seat tube angle, none of the geometry numbers on the Cascade Peak really stood out all that much. And I think that played a big part in just how easy this bike was to get out and enjoy straight out of the box. The climbing position was comfortable on a variety of gradients, and despite the frontward weight bias from the steep seat tube angle, there was still plenty of rear wheel traction on more technical climbs. On the way back down, the cockpit felt roomy but not overly stretched out, which was enough to inspire confidence on bigger features, but also easy to lean into corners and throw around in the air. I was also impressed by the stiff planted chassis, which I'm sure is due in large part to that beefy new one-piece rocker link. When all was said and done, I ended up riding the Cascade Peak on a variety of green, blue, and black single track, and throughout that time, there really wasn't a place where it felt out of place or undergunned. And no, it wasn't the most playful or the fastest climber, but it felt comfortable and competent pretty much everywhere. One of the things that I think played a huge factor in just how versatile this bike was its suspension setup. Our Pro build features DVO's top shelf Diamond D1 fork and new Opal HV T3 shock. The fork features high and low speed compression adjustment, as well as DVO's proprietary OTT, or off-the-top negative airspring adjustment, that affects the sensitivity at the top of the travel. I usually run just a bit more pressure in my fork than the manufacturer recommends because I prefer having more mid-stroke support. And I found that by turning that OTT dial a few rotations towards its most sensitive setting, the bike's small bump compliance and front end grip was on par, if not better, than anything I've ridden from RockShox or Fox. And it was a similar story at the back of the bike. While the Opal shock didn't have quite as much adjustment as the fork did, it was still very, if anything, too sensitive at the top of the suspension. It's one of those bikes that felt like you were short 10 or 20 PSI while you were riding, but then got back to your car at the end of the ride only to find that you'd been using like 80% of your travel. I'll be honest that this took a bit of getting used to, but in the end, I really enjoyed it. It meant that you could comfortably cruise over Chundari trails, but when you really wanted to charge, you're rewarded with a nice firm platform to push off of and pretty dang good bottom out resistance on those bigger hits and drops. But this soft suspension did have one major trade-off, and that was while climbing. The TetraLink 4-bar system Ari uses on the Cascade proved to be very active under pedaling. When left in the open or even mid setting, you could visibly see the rocker link bobbing as you trudged along. And I found that on anything other than the most technical climbs, I prefer to have it in the firm setting. Thankfully though, the climb switch is large and easily accessible while riding, but I would regularly forget to change it when the trail pointed back down. That said, I'm sure this is a habit you'd get used to if you owned the bike. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is the SRAM group set. You'll get a full GX drivetrain, including a GX cassette, which unsurprisingly performed without issues. Braking duties are taken care of by a set of SRAM DB8s paired to two 180mm rotors. Now, don't get me wrong, I know plenty of people who are a lot more picky about brake setup than I am, but I've never found these DB8s to be an issue on a 135mm bike like the Cascade Peak. That said, if you did want to eke a little bit more power out of them, you could of course throw in some sintered pads or upgrade your rotor size. Another big highlight for me on this bike were the tires. Now, OEM tire choice has shifted a lot over the last 5 years, from lightweight undergun tires to super burly aggressive tires, and these days it's not uncommon to see something like a Maxxis Assegai on a mid-travel trail bike. But the Cascade Peak has a very sensible Maxxis DHF in the front and an Aggressor in the rear, both of which have a 2.5-inch width with EXO casings. The low rolling resistance of the Aggressor was definitely appreciated on the climbs, and while it did break loose a bit more easily than some other tires, it did so in a very predictable and, dare I say, even fun sort of a way. Ari is a direct-to-consumer brand, which means unless you live close to their headquarters in Utah, you're likely going to be buying one of these bikes online without having the ability to do a test ride or have a shop employee fit you to a bike. What Ari has instead is what they call the 23-point custom setup that you go through when ordering. During this, you'll provide them with a variety of body measurements and in return get suggestions on everything from crank and stem length to dropper post size. Now, unlike a lot of direct-to-consumer brands, Ari has chosen not to skimp out on important touch points like the WTB Volt saddle and Ergon GA20 grips. And that brings me back full circle to just how fun and easy this bike is to get along with straight out of the box. And in my opinion, that places it a step higher than a lot of other budget-oriented direct-to-consumer brands. But that's not to say that there's not a lot of competition for the Ari. In fact, just about every major manufacturer has a $3,000-ish trail bike. Now, some of these bikes really suffer due to the low components they're spec'd with, but a lot of them offer pretty formidable competition. The first bike that we're going to be comparing the Ari Cascade Peak to is the Polygon Siskiyou T9. This is another performance-packed direct-to-consumer trail bike that was also released earlier this year. It too lists for $2,999 and rolls on 29-inch wheels, has 135mm of travel in the back, and a 140mm fork. Despite having nearly identical geometry and travel numbers, the T9 feels like quite a bit bigger bike when you're out on the trail, both for better and for worse. And I think a lot of this comes down to the beefier suspension, slightly heavier frame, and some super aggressive tires. I personally prefer the more sprightly feel of the Cascade Peak, but again, that's going to come down to personal preference. Now, in terms of part spec, I think I am going to have to give it to the T9. It comes with some Fox Performance Elite suspension, a Shimano XT drivetrain, and some TRP DH Evo brakes. So which is best for you? Well, if you're looking for more of like a mini enduro sled that you can use at the bike park or for shuttle riding, then I think you'd be better suited with the Polygon. But if you're looking for more of a traditional trail bike that you'll use for long days in the saddle, then I think the Ari is probably the better option. The next bike that we're going to compare the Cascade Peak to goes in the opposite direction on the spectrum, and that is the Ibis Ripley AF. This bike and its longer-legged sibling, the Ritmo AF, have become a bit of a cult classic since their release a few years ago. The $3,000 Ripley once again shares very similar geometry to the Cascade Peak, but this time it does so with less travel. More specifically, it gets 120 millimeters in the back and 130 millimeters up front. These numbers teeter on the downcountry category, and the bike has some pretty lightweight suspension to match. It gets a Fox 34 fork with a DPS shock. Together, this helps keep the bike weight at just under 33 pounds or 15 kilograms. That's about 1.5 pounds lighter than the Cascade Peak. The rest of the components on these two bikes are very comparable, and to be honest, that's impressive seeing as Ibis is a traditional B2C brand. Once again, the best bike for you is going to come down to your riding style and terrain. That lower weight and decreased suspension travel on the Ibis will make for a very maneuverable and efficient bike, whereas that added plushness on the Ari will make for a bike that's a bit more fun and forgiving in rougher terrain. I have to admit, as a Utah native, I've always been a fan of Fezzari bikes, but I've been a bit disappointed over the last couple years as it seems like they haven't been able to keep up with the quickly progressing mountain bike industry. But I think it's safe to say that this switch to Ari has been much more than a simple rebrand, and the new Cascade Peak is a huge leap forward from the model it replaces. If you're looking for an affordable, well-spec'd trail bike with some pretty dang dialed suspension performance, you don't mind having a couple extra pounds to carry around, then I think the Ari Cascade Peak could be a great bike for you. Again, I've honestly been impressed and surprised by just how good it is. Now, if you have any more questions about this bike, please go ahead and leave those in the comments and I'll do my best to find you an answer. While you're there, if you haven't done so already, I'd really appreciate it if you take just a second to like this video and subscribe to the 99 Spokes channel, where we upload a new video every Friday. Lastly, as always, remember that bikes are for everyone. Have fun out there.